Hello, our group will be covering Chapter 10, Historical Research. We first must answer the question, what is historical research? At its core, historical research deals with the meanings of events, aka it is the interpretation of the facts. The task of the historical researcher is not merely to describe what events took place, but to present a factually supported rationale to suggest how and why they may have happened. Note, with the word historical, it's a common thing to get confused with history, or you think that everything historical has to be related to history. Well, this is not true because historical research is not purely what we think of historical. Historical research can cover a variety of topics such as geography, anthropology, linguistics, etc. Comparative historical research compares historical events and processes across two or more societies or cultures. With historical research, there's a goal of identifying similarities, differences, and patterns that reflect cause and effect relationships.
One example of historical research is data sources. Primary and secondary sources are, primary sources is when a source first appeared in time or when or soon after the event occurred. So examples of what primary sources can be include letters, diaries, newspaper articles, sermons, laws, census reports, immigration records, probate documents, deeds, photographs, paintings, films, buildings, and labor-saving tools. On the other hand, secondary sources are works of historians who have interpreted and written about primary sources. So examples of these would be history textbooks, scholarly books, and articles. One example of historic data is narrative research. Interview data is a good example of this narrative oral research. The researcher must remember that the participants' recollections aren't always accurate. Only when people recall similar events can there be a confidence in an interview. However, words, images, and objects aren't the only forms of primary historic data. There are also quantitative measures, as numbers can be looked at on books of various topics that were sold during a certain period. Sometimes the raw numerical values suffice for the researcher's purpose, and other times it does not. Other times there needs to be statistical analysis of the data. In secondary sources, there is room for personal bias. Virtually any report of an event is to be somewhat distorted in line with the writer's basic beliefs and assumptions, even if considered to be a primary source. Researchers can probably never determine the ultimate truth under a body of data. And secondary sources, lastly, can even use bias to our advantage as the writer to get a better handle on the prevailing perspectives of the time. Next are ways to collect historical records. So if the first way is to make copies. Historical researchers make copies of primary sources, and they are found in archival collections such as libraries, museums, and historical societies. The second way is to take photos. Photocopy with a digital camera may work, as many institutions provide photocopies for a small fee. A digital camera requires less light than photocopying, so it is better for the environment and it does not produce fragile copies. Photographs can also be directly loaded onto a computer for easy cutting and pasting.
As Caitlin said, when collecting historical records, specifically for historical events, we must keep in mind that some historical documents and records can only be found in the archives of various libraries, museums, and historical societies around the world. So we can use these online historical resources that are more accessible, such as American History and Video, Ancestry Library, digitized primary American history resources, digitized world history sources, early American newspapers, ProQuest historical newspapers, historical statistics of the US, or government websites like the US Library of Congress, which is pictured on the right. And especially in a time like COVID, it's a good alternative to use online databases because we can't go out into museums as much anymore to see data for our research.
So after we have collected our historical data and research using the techniques that Emily and Caitlin have talked about, we need to then evaluate and interpret this historical data. The first thing we will need to do is analyze some external evidence versus internal evidence. So what are these items? In this fashion, external evidence or evidence in general is not what we normally think as evidence. Evidence here is a way to analyze our historical piece or our article or our data. We will need to use these techniques in order to find out if our item is something that we should use. So external evidence is finding out, is the article genuine? We need to establish authenticity of the piece using methods such as perhaps carbon dating, handwriting analysis, language or time study, and paper and ink identification. These would be more for items such as paintings or really old documents that you could be able to test those things, but they're not really as relevant in our digital age. The main message is that we do not want to use counterfeit or fake information. And so the way we examine that is through using external evidence. Moving to internal evidence, we now want to look at what does the text actually mean? What is the painting telling us, or what is the article trying to say? What do certain words in the text mean? Who is the author addressing and referring to in the global context? And this can be found in graphic, verbal, and written documents, but it can also be found in another variety of ways. Here we will look at an example on how to examine external and internal evidence. So let's look at this painting, which is called Planting Chrysanthemums, and it's archived from the Met Museum. And it's a painting from the Ming Dynasty. So if we were studying the theories of historical paintings from the Ming Dynasty, you would first need to examine if the piece is authentic by perhaps testing the paper or type of ink used, etc. You want to test like the amount of perhaps the authenticity of the stamps used, the brush techniques, all of that kind of stuff is external evidence. As I said, it is archived from the Met Museum, which means it's already online as public domain. And in that way, we know that it has already gone through the process of authentication by the museum. So for us, this external evidence may just involve source checking. We just need to check the source of the Met Museum and find out where that data came from in order to mark it as authentic. We don't really need to do all the testing the paper type stuff on our own because, well, that's impossible. We can just leave that up to whoever is doing it at the museum. So moving to internal evidence again would require you to then extract the meaning from the piece and the text written on it, which is not shown, but there is a small poem that goes along with this that shows the meaning of the painting, and that's where we can extract internal evidence from. And then we would need to find the greater context historically. Okay, so moving on to interpretation and assumptions. Interpretation and assumptions are both really big parts of examining and drawing meaning from a certain piece. When interpreting historical data, a researcher must inevitably impose certain assumptions on them. Good historical researchers, though, identify explicitly and concretely these assumptions that have guided their interpretations of historical data. Correct identifications and assumptions will add to the interpretation greatly and will increase the complexity of your work. In this way, assumptions are actually necessary as a part of interpretation, and they're not something that are completely bad like we're used to thinking. we're used to thinking that, oh, we should not ever make assumptions. We need to find all the evidence in our actual data. This is true to an extent, however, because in historical research, there are going to be inevitable gaps that we will need to fill based on these assumptions that we make. So an example of this could be, for example, Dora. Given this picture, and given the phrase Dora the blank, how we will figure out what Dora is. So obviously we know this is Dora the Explorer, but we can find out those items from the picture, perhaps, if we were 50 years in the future and we magically didn't know what Dora was. We could identify how she has her map, her backpack, and how she looks enthusiastic to explore the world, and assume that she's some type of explorer. So while maybe in the future we wouldn't correctly identify it as Dora the Explorer, maybe we could say Dora the Backpacker, we would still have the same idea and we'll be able to correctly base our interpretation off of that. Another example could be how in my personal research project, how I have to make assumptions on certain items that I feel that are influencing the most in our society. So my project is on how scientific distrust is decreasing in the community in our country, and I have to correctly make some assumptions on what I think are the main factors. And these have a lot of evidence to back them up, but I need to also make assumptions along with that in order to correctly provide my interpretation.
As Wynn said at the beginning, remember that historical research does not simply relate to historical events, even though we covered those. It can also relate to the origin, development, and influence of ideas and concepts. So an example would be the idea of democracy would lead to concepts like representative government and political campaigning. So if you think about it like a history book, if you have the events and everything, but there's also terms, and those terms can branch off into future topics later, which might relate to your research. So questions you might want to ask yourself would be, where did it come from? How did it all begin? And note that causal factors are sometimes called ex post facto research, but this should not be confused with ex post facto historical research. Historical research should not be confused with the ex post facto designs. So in this, we should be searching for roots. And the example for this, going back to the Dora metaphor, would be that we would need to go back through the map to figure out where your idea came from. So for example, in my research studying mutual funds, I might want to compare index and active funds. So for historical research, I might look into the first differentiation between those two types of funds and figure out what made each of them successful, which would lead to why companies would choose to use those methods in the current day. In writing the historical research report, rule 1 is to state your own argument early. You need to both interpret and present the data, so be upfront. If you think about this like a UC essay, for example, we know that word count is very limited in those, and obviously the research report is not as limited, but you want to make sure that you get everything across because you need to state what you want to say and why you say that as well. Rule number 2 is that you should provide examples to support any assertion that you make. You want to take a credible persona, and assertions that you make in a research report specifically should be backed by research, obviously. Rule 3 is to give the fairest possible treatment of any perspectives different from your own. You want to provide support and counter arguments of competing interpretations. These should also be backed by research and logical thinking. And lastly, rule 4 is to point out the weaknesses of your own argument. You want to portray yourself as a credible researcher with objectivity. So this helps in not showing bias and bringing up specific points that might weaken your argument or strengthen your argument are also important to note. Thank you and happy researching.